Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And this afternoon, we are going to look at the US tariffs, right? The US China's trade war. And is Jamaica involved, or should we involve ourselves in a fight between China and the United States? Or is the war a fight between the United States and China? Or is it really a war at the end of the day? Is it a fight against working and middle class people? What do you think? Do you think that it's just a war against countries, that the United States is waging this unnecessary war against countries, a war that is unjustifiable? Or do you think that the elites of the world, the global elites, are waging a war, an economic war, an all-out economic war against working and the working and middle classes? I think that is the latter. I think that superficially we are seeing, of course, wars among countries, and we are suggesting, well, the war is mainly against the United States and China. The United States has always wanted to dethrone China as the manufacturing hub of the world. China has grown too powerful a country, and the United States does not like it. Remember, now we talked about the whole matter of full spectrum dominance, and it is the United States' quest to achieve full spectrum dominance. And that's why we're seeing all these wars, from the Cold War onwards to the war on terror, a war that is being waged in the Middle East and other parts of the world. It is interesting how the US media lie. And they will tell you that the United States is doing all these things, even though they are not a country at war. The United States has been at war officially since 2001 after 9/11. The war on terror has never ended. In fact, Bush was quite explicit in his statement that the war on terror would continue until all terrorists are defeated. And we're hearing from Trump now, from the Trump administration, that they are in collaboration with military contractors trying to get rid of all the criminals in America, on the American continent, as far away from the American continent to places the likes of El Salvador, in where you have that popular, terrible, horrific prison cell in El Salvador that is being managed and governed by Presidente Bukele. Now, the fact of the matter is, everything that we're seeing in, unfolding in the world, I should say, are interconnected in some way or the other. But let us not take sides. We ought to look carefully at what is happening. I did remind you in my videos previously that during the US Civil War, that the white Americans in the South, the Southern whites, they thought that they were fighting a noble war, a war that would have defended their states' rights against what they thought the Northerners were trying to impose upon them, an anti-slavery agenda, which they wanted, and that was at the hub of their economy. They thought so. They really thought that they were fighting against the North to preserve their states' rights and their rights of peddling slavery. However, 2 years and a half into the war, these Southern whites found out that, look here, this war is not about us, it's about the elites. And they're trying to cement their dominion over North America. And they said they don't want to fight anymore. Many of them decided that they were not going to participate in the fight anymore. Are these Southerners, these white Southern people who barely had an education, but were able to look keenly and critically at the developments of what was taking place in the United States during the 19th century, the mid-19th century. Yet they had enough intelligence to see that the US Civil War, was not about the ordinary man, right? It was about US elites and their hegemony on the continent, on the North American continent, particularly on the continental shores of the United States. So we've got also to understand that the war that is being waged, this tariff war, this trade war, is really not about us. It's about the global elites. Now, the war is waged against us. They don't like us. they think that we are parasites. While they're the parasites, they think that we're parasites and that we demand too much. They think freedom has made us a little bit hoity-toity as citizens, and that we need to, they need to take away everything from us so that we can be humbled again, so that they can control every aspect of our lives. Something that you have to understand. But the Gleaner, this morning had an editorial which was quite interesting, coming from the Daily Gleaner of Jamaica, which says, "Be careful how we grow." And that was it was the Gleaner's article or editorial was in response to Aubyn Hill, that's the Minister of Trade and Commerce of Jamaica, who mentioned that the trade war, the war between China and the United States, is not a war that we need to be a part of, that Jamaica needs to be a part of. And I say, really, really now, is the war again are we not involved? Yes, we are involved, but we have to look at what Jamaica is involved and in whose interests are they defending whatever fight that they might be engaged in. Remember now that there is a distinction between the elites and the ordinary man in Jamaica. Now, whenever we're hearing economic policies, the economic policies coming out of all the countries of the world, including the United States, are policies that will defend the elites, right? Not policies that will defend working class, and to a lesser extent, and to a larger extent, well, I should say lesser extent, middle class, not to a larger extent. But the fact is that we have now to analyze what is here at play. And beyond reacting to everything that we are seeing coming out of the news, we have to delve into the facts to see how it is going to affect us, and to see if our governments are doing things in our best interest, right? So Aubyn Hill suggested that, this war is not, we should not participate in this war. Jamaicans should not participate in this war. It's not about us. We should not be involved. We should not get involved. But ordinary Jamaicans perhaps will say, yes, we should get involved, because we too need a manufacturing base. Trump is complaining that the United States has lost its manufacturing base, particularly after the signing of NAFTA. Now, when I started my undergraduate studies at Howard University many years ago, I shall not disclose my age at the moment, I was very enthralled at what I read about Mexico and the signing, and also Canada, the signing of the NAFTA agreement. In fact, I was so much enthralled by the NAFTA treaty that I brought articles to my professors. I told them that, here, look at this, we have to read this, we have to be involved in what is happening here. And, I remembered, one of my professors, she accommodated some of my articles and asked me to send them, and she made a package for students to read, because that is how obsessed I was with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I knew at the time was an unfair agreement and had, contributed to the United States losing hundreds and thousands of jobs. Now, at the time, I wasn't aware how it was going to impact the United States to a great extent, because that was like 2001 when I was, doing my undergraduate studies. 2000 thereabout, yeah, when I was pursuing my undergraduate studies. And now we're seeing, after the war on terror, that the United States has found itself, and particularly after the global meltdown, the global recession of 2008, the United States has found itself in a precarious economic downfall, a downfall that I'm not sure how she's going to be able to lift herself out of that mud. Now, when I say lift herself, I mean the ordinary working class and middle classes. How are they going to lift? Because the elites are going to be able to. They're actually becoming richer. And if we look at the history of the United States, economic history, that is, we are going to see, particularly after the global recession into the pandemic, that we have had an escalation of billionaires and billionaires in the United States, while we're seeing a steep decline in the wealth of ordinary American citizens. So Trump, in his quest to help his base, that's what he's suggesting, he wants to return the manufacturing base to the United States. But is that going to happen? Because when we look at what the United States worker would demand, even if, they're not going to pay them the $15 per hour. But let us say that they will have to pay them $10 or $12 per hour. That's a lot in comparison to what the US capitalists might be paying in Vietnam or in China, where they might be paying $6 or $3 or whatever. It is still way lower than they would pay in the United States. And believe you me, $15 per hour in the United States is not a lot of money. $15 per hour in the United States is not a lot of money. It's not even a lot of money in the Caribbean, right? But imagine the United States, where people have to rent for much higher prices and to pay higher mortgages. So we must take these things into, now, is Trump right? Is he doing the right thing to impose tariffs on these countries? Now, what we have to say, governments have the right to do that which is in the interest of their people. On the other hand, we are seeing a situation in which governments have been defending the rights of the elites who brought them to power. And that is the conundrum that we are faced with right now. We don't know, because we can't read men's hearts, as I've suggested in previous videos, if his motive is sincere in terms of wanting to bring back manufacturing base to the United States. Is it fair? Or is it that he just wants to bring back some so that he can enrich the US military-industrial complex? Only the future will tell. Only the future will tell what is happening. But certainly in Jamaica, we should also be having an open conversation in terms of how did globalization move us forward? How did globalization, enrich us, or did it actually impoverish us? And I think the latter is true, that participating in globalization and in the era of neoliberalism, those two words and those two economic philosophies have really impoverished the island of Jamaica, right? Beyond the superficial that we see, where we have lots of phones and lots of smart TVs and some cars on the roads. But remember now that we are indebted and the majority of our people cannot afford basic cost of living. Last night, I was talking to one of my family members, and she was telling me that even in private hospitals, she was at a private hospital recently in Mandeville, and that private hospital did not have tissue and soap in the bathroom. Basic things, and it's a private hospital. They didn't have basic ingredients, basic things that you'd think a hospital should have. They didn't have. Now, can you imagine the state of our public hospitals? And I thought, based on my recollections, when I was hospitalized in Jamaica some years ago in the 1980s, that the situation was better. It wasn't great, but the situation was better. At least they had toilet paper, soap, and the bathrooms were, for the most part, clean. No, you can't say the same thing that is happening in Jamaica. So something has happened, something has destroyed our economic base, and we have to find out what that is. But let's go back to the Gleaner and what the Gleaner is suggesting here. The Gleaner is saying that while Jamaica ought not to be deliberately, or they ought not to deliberately jump into the middle of the tariff war Donald Trump unleashed on the rest of the world, Aubyn Hill would be advised to be circumspect about celebrating gains from collateral damage caused by the conflict. Given Mr. Trump's record in abiding by trade deals, even those he negotiates, there is no certainty that anything agreed to will be adhered to and not unraveled. So, as Jamaica seeks to insulate itself from Mr. Trump's roller coaster tariff policies, the island, with other members of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, should seriously review Gordon Brown's idea of creating an economic coalition of the willing to cushion the likely effects of the Trump project, and whether there is value and space in that coalition for poor countries of the global south, like those that comprise CARICOM. A fortnight ago, Mr. Trump, the US president, announced a base tariff of 10% on imports into the United States, but set much higher duties for several countries. China, America's major economic and geopolitical rival, is at the top with 145%. CARICOM countries except Guyana, 38%, are to be charged at the base rate. So here we have seen that, and it doesn't seem to me that Jamaica thinks that we should be engaged in this war. Not that we should go out and protest, because that is not going to help us in any situation. But what we have to do now, we have to sit down as a people and have an open intellectual debate about economic history and how we have fared along that line of history. We have to do that. We have not yet begun to do that. I think what we're doing, a lot of what is coming out of our universities is disappointing, to say the least. People are not being taught what they should learn, right? And to argue and to debate the important things of life. What we are thinking is that people are just coming out empty-brained. Knowledge is selective. They select a certain amount of knowledge that they want you to be exposed to. And lots of students do not have curiosity. And even within my generation, I think that we lack the intellectual curiosity. I think that is where what Generation X, right, that of which I'm a part, I think that we did not learn that. We lost it. Somehow we lost it. Some people are complaining that the baby boomers, they are the ones who destroyed the economy. But I think that when it came now on to the next generation with Generation X, which my generation is a part of, I think that we lost that intellectual curiosity. So many of what you see now coming out of the universities from my generation and beyond are not people who are really educated. They're titled. They have lots of titles, the BAs and the MAs and the MScs and the PhDs, but they do not have the competence and the intellectual understanding of how the world works, right? How the world functions, as it were. Now, citing Gordon Brown, who was a former Prime Minister of Great Britain, is not something that I was very impressed with the Gleaner, quoting a man who believes in neoliberalism, because surely he and Tony Blair were faces of the neoliberal ideology in Great Britain. And if you study the likes of these men, they are neocons, so they're pro-war, and they're not particularly interested in working class and the middle class, in working and middle class concerns. They're not, right? And, years ago, maybe in 2002 to 2004, I was impressed with Tony Blair, right? I was impressed by his dexterity, his behavior in Parliament, and his capacity to debate, right? And to have these very lively political debates. But, as I read and I, studied more about economics, I realized that he himself was like a Bill Clinton, right? Someone who was gifted at speaking, but at the end of the day, he does not really mean the people well, right? And he's working against the average citizen of their countries. Now, let us look at what Gordon Brown had to say in his article. Trump is pushing the world towards recession. By learning the lessons rather of 2008, we can still prevent it. Now, did we learn a lesson? And I read the article before the Gleaner quoted it. I read it on the day on which it was published in the UK Guardian newspaper, and I did not think that it was a fantastic piece. However, since the Gleaner is quoting from it, let me see if I can share my screen with you, and we will analyze a few paragraphs from Gordon Brown's assertions, his pronouncements. It's amazing how we worship these men, and we look at Trump as being an enemy of the state and of the global economy, yet still we revere these men who are also the ones who have helped destroy our domestic economies. No more than a narrow window of opportunity remains if we are to prevent an unnecessary global recession. As China and the US decouple, disruptive trade wars are intensifying and threaten to descend into currency wars, import, export, investment, and technology bans and financial fire sales that will destroy millions of jobs worldwide. It seems barely incredible that the world is being brought to its knees by one economy, outside of which we live, 96% of the population, who produce 84% of the world's manufactured goods. One of the things that is interesting is that the war is between two countries One, the country with the most consumption, which is the United States, and the other country, China, which is the country which is most productive, right? Which has the most producers. Something that is interesting, right? So here we have a war between a country that consumes, that has the largest consumption in the world, which is the United States, producing hardly anything but arms, right? Which is something that should really rock you and say, my God, that the United States has descended into a country that is just consuming. And when you look at how big they are, how massive they are, you know that something is definitely wrong with that country. But even though US officials have previously talked of a tariff policy of escalate to de-escalate, Donald Trump's aim is to force manufacturing back to the United States, and his 90-day relaxation of some tariffs does not mean he intends to diffuse the crisis. So he's here revealing to us that Donald Trump is not going to diffuse the crisis. This 90-day pause is just to reflect and maybe to sharpen, to refine more his tariff policies, which could be more draconic after he has refined these policies. On Monday, that's Keir Starmer warned that the world will never be the same again. And when did we hear that? We heard that after 9/11, that the world would never be the same again after the war on terror. And now, is this also a war on the people? This an economic war, an all-out economic war on the global population? I think it is, because they're destroying all the fundamental base of the economy. And people have been talking about the Great Reset and the fact that they want us to transition from dollarized economy, where we have dollars, right, to a, what do you call it now, a digital economy. So it could be that this Trump war, all of these people, including the Gordon Browns and the left, the so-called left of the West, are involved in reshaping, including China, the global economy, transitioning it from a dollarized economy to more of a digital economy, right? The future will tell. I can't say that of a fact. As I learned in the financial crisis of 2008, global problems require globally coordinated solutions. And what solutions did they have? But to have bailed out the people who caused the problem in 2008. So did we really learn? We didn't. And he's not suggesting here that we learned anything from it more than that they bailed out the wealthy and caused the poor to have become more impoverished. We need a bold international response that measures up to the scale of the emergency. In the same way that, to his great credit, the Prime Minister has been building a coalition in defense of Ukraine, which they are warmongers, we need an economic coalition of the willing, like-minded global leaders who believe that in an interdependent world, who wants an interdependent world? We have to coordinate economic policies across continents if we are to safeguard jobs and living standards. But they told us during NAFTA that that's what they're going to do. They are going to create lots of jobs. Didn't they say that? Yes, they said it. And let me share a document with you that I have here on my screen about the NAFTA, which was published by Public Citizen, right? The Public Citizen, that's what I think. That's the name of the think tank or organization that published this document on the effects of the free trade agreement, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Lost jobs, lower wages, increased inequality. This is what NAFTA did. So NAFTA, that's what the article is, legacy, NAFTA or NAFTA's legacy. Now, the North American Free Trade the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's NAFTA, was sold to the US public in 1993 with grand promises. Grand promises as they're doing now. They did in 2001, and after 9/11, after the meltdown, we are reorienting, we are refashioning the economy, and what we're seeing, right? That people are getting poorer while the rich is getting richer. That projection was based on a study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics that modeled how NAFTA's elimination of Mexico and Canadian tariffs would result in the growth of US exports that would outpace growth in imports from other NAFTA countries, which was not true. They always have these modeling. And these modeling so forth. And that is why, economics is not a science. It's not a specific field of study, really, right? You're just wasting your time if you're going to school studying to be an economist. You can read and become an economist, right? By expanding our pre-NAFTA trade surplus with Mexico and improving the U.S. trade balance with Canada, with which the United States had a small pre-NAFTA deficit, NAFTA would create numerous U.S. jobs. But did it create numerous U.S. jobs? I don't think so. But instead of an improved trade balance with Canada and Mexico, NAFTA resulted in an explosion of imports that led to a huge new U.S. NAFTA trade deficit. And that is what happened in Jamaica too with the free trade agreements in the 1990s. And then we saw the collapse of all the domestic productive capacities in Jamaica, the dairy industry, the insurance industries, everything collapsed in the 1990s. And that was as a result of the free trade agreements, right? And our people were, they essentially became poorer, right? More impoverished. So we can see here that U.S. goods trade deficit with Canada and Mexico increases 584% over NAFTA period. That's a whole lot. Look at that. And this article was actually published in 2018. And they're looking from 1989 right up to 2000. And look at the explosion. Okay, it went down a little here, and then the explosion went up and it goes. So there was absolutely no decrease in the deficit, right? The deficit, with these countries, the US's deficit with these countries only exploded. More than 980,000 specific US jobs have been certified by the US Labor Department as lost to NAFTA, outsourcing and import floods under just one narrow program. So I'm sure it has increased by now. Maybe it has increased to over 1 million, right? This is a significant undercount of the job loss, given that the program Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, excluded many categories of workers during NAFTA's first decade of damage, and reporting is voluntary, so only those who know about the program and do the work to apply are even considered. So the number they're suggesting here could be way higher. The mass outsourcing of American jobs was the outcome about which NAFTA opponents had warned, right? And this was President Bill Clinton's, authorship, right? He was the one who implemented this free trade agreement. At the heart of NAFTA are special protections that make it cheaper and safer for corporations to outsource U.S. jobs to low-wage Mexico. These investor protections provide special benefits to firms that relocate and eliminate many of the usual risks that make corporations think twice about moving production to another country. With Mexican manufacturing workers paid a fraction of what U.S. workers are paid, some U.S. companies had begun to relocate production to Mexico before the NAFTA. Many of these jobs were in industries such as apparel that did not require major investments to open a factory. But NAFTA's investor protections made it safe for U.S. firms to relocate high-end manufacturing jobs. And because Mexico did not have independent unions, the U.S. corporations could rely on wages staying low. So that is what they did. There were no unions, and the protections that seemed to have stood up for the rights of workers were removed. So Mexico, the corporatists were able to transfer their manufacturing base to Mexico and to exploit labor in Mexico, right? But at the same time, these capitalists, they would send back their goods to America. Right, and then the trade deficit, even though it was American corporations who were producing them, between the U.S. and Mexico grew. Now, if that wasn't deliberate, you tell me what the word deliberate means. If that was not intentional, because this has been going on for years, and I'm sure that after 5-6 years, that the so-called economists could have looked at what is happening and say, we need to overhaul this sort of agreement, this sort of free trade agreement. But NAFTA is only the example because you have CAFTA, the expanded and the free trade agreements of the Americas, right? And Jamaica has not benefited, as you can see, because what we have, we are an import-dependent society. So yes, the war between the United States and China, we should be involved in that war in the sense that we should be having a conversation about how these free trade agreements affected Jamaica as a country and contributed largely to our lack of development. But we're not having these conversations. We choose to make these conversations political, and we cling to the left, to the so-called left or center left of the political discourse. And that, what they say there is often lies. We can't listen to the center of left politicians and their economic ideologies anymore, because they're living in a utopian society that doesn't exist. Now, this was a writing by Chalmers Johnson, Whatever Happened to Globalization? And he says here, even though the Soviet Union had lost its potency as an economic challenger, the United States and its allies had for some time been worried by other trends. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that's GATT, and we need to read more of the history of this General Agreements of Tariff and Trade. The rules governing the opening of trade drawn up by the United States and Britain in World War II, because they were the ones who dropped the rules, the economic order. And they talk about the rules-based order as if it's governed by rules. And subsequently signed by some 21 other countries or nations, had ensured spectacular growth in international trade. So after World War II, and with the economic landscape that the United States and Britain had actually formulated, had actually crafted, the world's economy was growing. Right? It was growing. The purpose of GATT, which was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was to prevent a recurrence of the economic nationalism and collapse of international trade that had caused the Great Depression and contributed directly to the emergence of totalitarian regimes in Europe and Asia. Listen to what he's saying here. Listen to what this intellectual, now deceased, is suggesting. Between 1948 and 1995, when GATT, that's the general concept, that the general tariffs on the general agreement rather on tariffs and trade was replaced by the World Trade Organization, international trade expanded from 124 billion to over 10,772 billion US dollars. Right? From 1948, between 1948 and 1995. Before the World Trade Organization was founded. So this pattern was fine with the United States so long as its trade balance remained favorable and it could dictate the terms on which others participated in the good times. So those were good times. But let us look at what he's saying here. The 1970s, however, had already ushered in a period of questioning about where the capitalist world was heading, because the United States was on a decline, on a rapid economic decline. The American and British economies were plagued by stagflation, high rates of inflation combined with low economic growth, high rates of unemployment, large public sector deficits, two major oil crises as producer nations sought to influence the policies of consuming nations, racial strife, and for the United States, defeat in Vietnam. The defeat in Vietnam caused the United States severe economic distress. The defeat of the United States in Vietnam caused the United States severe economic distress. Very important that you understand that. Equally ominous, by the mid-1980s, Japan had displaced the United States, as we see China now doing. So let me repeat that. In the mid-1980s, Japan had displaced the United States as the world's leading creditor nation, while America's fiscal deficits and its inability to cover the costs of products imported from foreign countries turned it into the world's largest debtor. So by the 1980s, the United States, the mid-1980s, that is, the United States had already been converted into the what? The world's largest debtor, which it is to this day, right? And that is why it has sought to reshape as decades go by the global economic order, right? It's important that we understand this. It's important that we understand. But look at the economies of the world when they had the general agreement on tariffs and trade, that the economies actually grew and they prospered. But when the United States now saw that it had emerged as the world's greatest debtor nation. And look at China now, which is really practically a creditor nation. It bothers her, and she begins now to refashion the global order. And I told you that in the 1970s, when President Nixon actually, moved away from the gold standard, that was also an economic catastrophe. Many of us are not talking about that. And we had an economist from Europe, a Greek economist, who suggested that sort of economic plan by Nixon, his removing the US dollars from the gold standard and having now what we call a petrodollar, it devastated Europe, the economies of Europe, that it took them 20 years to rebuild their economies in Europe. And they culminated with the forging of the European Union, what we now call the European Union, because they thought that that's the only way that they could fight the United States. 20 years for economies of Europe to have been resuscitated because of what Nixon did in 1971. By removing the gold standard from the dollar, from the US dollar, and by extension, the monies of the world, right? So we are seeing a situation in which this history, we cannot forget history. Then we moved from the 1970s and 80s of stagflation, and we went into the age of neoliberalism, which we just read about, the NAFTA and all of what took place, and the fact that the United States was deindustrialized. Now, how can you have the greatest nation on earth being deindustrialized and just being a consumption nation? And people of consumption, where they just consume a lot. And that is why we're seeing now in the United States lots of poverty, high levels of poverty, right? And the country is getting poorer and poorer. Now, will Donald Trump be able to restore the manufacturing base? That is the question. Should working class and middle classes demand that from the Jamaican government? Yes, they should. We should also be having a conversation with Andrew Holness that we need also to become a productive society. And we need a manufacturing base in Jamaica. That is our war, not to talk against Donald Trump, though some of the things that we talk against him are merited. But what we should be having now in Jamaica are serious discussions about where do we move forward. But we have to review our past and look at the mistakes that we have made. But we'll still continue to align ourselves with the so-called global elites, with our colonial masters, like the Gordon Browns and the Tony Blairs and the Bill Clintons. And we listen to everything they say, the Barack Hussein Obamas. Yesterday, when I published a video, somebody was attacking me that Barack Obama did not contribute to where we find ourselves now, to the economic decline of the United States, according to him. He thinks it was only Bush. I had to remind him that yes, that Barack Hussein Obama contributed greatly, significantly, because he was the one who bailed out the bankers who caused the problem in the first place. He bailed them out, right? He bailed them out and did nothing for working Americans. And that is why they went to Trump in 2016 and back again to Trump in 2024. Now, will Trump do anything for the working and middle classes of America? I barely think so. Because as I am now an astute student, teacher, call me whatever, lecturer of the US military industrial complex, I don't think that based on where we are in this grand empire called the United States that Trump is going to do anything. Maybe some of the manufacturing that might go back to the United States, we don't know. If they do, maybe something will trickle down, but nothing great. It won't be the same thing as it used to be when one person in the United States, of the father, could go out to work and could send his children to school and they would not be indebted. It's not going to return to that era. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, because we see now that the capitalists, when they're making money, they're not going to go back. They're not going to regress where they're going to make less or generate less money. They want to make even more. So I'm sure even if they return to the United States, they are going to be negotiating with Trump in terms of how they can make more money, perhaps more than they're making in China. That is what they're going to do. And at the end of the day, it's not going to be in the interest of the working class. But is this Jamaica's war? Yes, it is, but not in the sense of a war in which we are going to be trading words back and forth with Trump and his administration. We need to have those open conversations, though they might be and they might elicit a lot of, terrible feelings and emotions because of what we did. And lies have to be unmasked and truth has to be told. But truth is going to be the revolution for us. Truth is what should be the fight. Economic truth. Where is Jamaica now? Are the IMF policies helping us? Or do we need to get out of the IMF immediately and begin to use those funds in building our economic base, in building our manufacturing industries in Jamaica? That is what we need to talk about, so that we can become a society that is prosperous, economically is prosperous. If we're still following the IMF policies and we're going to be getting investments from other countries and all of that we're talking about, we're not going to be wealthy, because all they're going down to Jamaica to do is to exploit us. That's what they want to do, to exploit some Black people, some hapless Black people walking in the land of Marcus Mosaic. Haven't we learned our lessons? Learn them, and let's begin now to deal with the hard lessons of history. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you like, share, and subscribe. Remember to like the videos and to leave a comment at the end of the video so that the videos can be pushed along and we can grow the channel as quickly as possible. Adios. Hasta luego.